At exactly 2:17 a.m., my phone blared with a motion alert from my garage, jolting me out of a deep sleep. Groggy and half-blind, I tapped the screen and blinked at the live security feed. What I saw made me sit up so fast I knocked over my water glass. There, crawling under the half-raised garage door in a pink hoodie, ski mask, and what looked like kitchen gloves, was Karen, my HOA's self-appointed queen and resident menace, shuffling in like a dollar store ninja. She held a flashlight in her mouth, bolt cutters in one hand, and a determined look on her face that screamed she believed she was on a sacred mission. I squinted, thinking maybe it was a prank. But then she stood up inside, stomped dramatically toward my ATV, and muttered, "Finally! I'm taking back what's rightfully mine." I couldn't decide whether to laugh, call the police, or grab popcorn. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a full-blown suburban soap opera unfolding live, starring Karen as the rogue heroine and my garage as her battleground. The real kicker? She didn't know the entire garage was equipped with 360-degree cameras, motion sensors, and a biometric lock system that could rival a military base. She also didn't know her face had already been scanned, logged, and denied by the facial ID system that locked everything down the moment she stepped inside. I hit record, leaned back, and whispered, "Game on." Now, let me rewind a bit, because if you don't know Karen, you might think this is an isolated incident. But this woman has been an itch under everyone's skin since the day she moved in and declared herself the enforcer of rules, real or imaginary. From issuing fake citations about my lawn being a half-inch too long, to shaming kids for chalk drawings on the sidewalk, Karen lives in a fantasy where she runs the neighborhood like some HOA dictatorship. Her latest obsession started a month ago when she caught sight of my all-black, upgraded ATV. It wasn't just a machine to her, it was a ghost from her past. Apparently, her late cousin, who had passed over a year ago, once owned an ATV that looked exactly like mine. According to her, the cousin had promised it to her before he passed, even though I had legally purchased mine from a Facebook marketplace listing, complete with bill of sale and registration. But Karen, in her delusional glory, convinced herself that I had somehow stolen her inheritance and vowed to reclaim it, one dramatic scene at a time. At first, she tried subtle harassment. She left notes on my door demanding I return her cousin's ATV, using phrases like blood rights and moral property, which I'm pretty sure she made up on the spot. When I ignored her, she went to the HOA board, but even they couldn't find a rule that said, "Karen gets whatever she wants." So, as with all great villains who face rejection, she turned to criminal creativity. Now here we were, at 2:17 a.m., with her fumbling around my garage like a raccoon on Red Bull, completely unaware that she'd triggered Fortress Protocol. That's the nickname I gave to the security system I personally programmed. See, I'm not just your average gearhead. I work in private tech security for defense clients. My garage is not just where I park my ride. It's a prototype zone for biometric locks, facial ID, and AI-integrated motion capture. Karen wasn't just breaking into a garage. She was trying to infiltrate a classified grade test site. As she approached the ATV, still clueless, she yanked on the handlebars and climbed aboard. She reached down to press the ignition button, but the panel lit up in a pulsing red glow. A robotic voice said, "Unauthorized face detected. Access denied." Karen froze, blinked, then frantically tapped the button again. "Unauthorized face detected. System locked." A second later, the garage lights cut out, replaced by red perimeter lighting, and the garage door slammed shut behind her. The internal speakers repeated, "Intruder containment initiated." That's when the panic set in. Karen, in full dramatic flair, began shouting, "Help! I'm trapped. Someone kidnapped me," which would have been more convincing if the live feed didn't show her voluntarily breaking in. I opened a private Discord server where I sometimes test security integrations with fellow developers and streamed the footage. Within minutes, there were comments rolling in like, "Is this real? Dude, is this a prank? And yo, is that woman trying to start your ATV with prayer? As she flailed around looking for an exit, one of the camera feeds zoomed in automatically on her face. She ripped off the hoodie, then accidentally kicked over a can of WD-40 and slipped, falling straight into the tool shelf. Wrenches clattered down around her like metal rain. The comments on the stream exploded with laughing emojis and timestamps for highlight reels. I had to mute my phone before Discord melted it. 5 minutes later, the automated system called the local authorities. I watched as she tried to pry open the locked garage door, only to be met with zero success. The voice from the wall speaker, which I had custom voiced using a digital assistant, said, "Attempting unauthorized egress. Law enforcement dispatched. Please remain still." She backed into a corner, looking genuinely shocked that her high-stakes heist was being thwarted by what she probably assumed was just a garage door opener and a ring cam. The cops arrived with sirens on low and flashlights high. When they knocked, I met them at the driveway with pajama pants, a hoodie, and a thermal mug of coffee. I calmly opened the control panel on my phone, disengaged the external lock, and watched as officers entered and found Karen sitting on an overturned paint bucket, arms crossed, muttering something about misguided justice. The officers were baffled. Karen immediately started crying and accusing me of stealing her property. "That's my cousin's ATV," she said dramatically, like she was about to win an Oscar. "He told me I could have it before he died. This thief stole it." One of the cops asked, "Do you have proof?" She pulled out a laminated obituary and waved it like a golden ticket. "It's all in here." I handed over a folder containing the bill of sale, registration, and transfer of ownership. The lead officer took one glance and said, "Ma'am, this seems legal and in order." Karen's expression twisted. She pointed to the camera and said, "Then why did your garage trap me inside like some kind of prison?" I smiled slightly and said, "Because you broke in like some kind of criminal." The officer turned back to her. "You weren't invited inside?" She shook her head. "No, but I had a right to enter," he cut her off. "You admitted you weren't invited." He shook his head, walked to his cruiser, and radioed for a report number. Karen, meanwhile, sat on the curb, dejected but defiant, telling one of the officers she was going to sue me for emotional trauma caused by facial scanners. I knew this wasn't the end. Karen never backs down. She doesn't retreat, she reloads. But what she didn't know was that everything she did had just been live-streamed to dozens of developers, half a dozen former security contractors, and a Redditor who was already preparing a Karen vs. Garage AI thread. She thought this was about an ATV. But now? Now it was war. And my side had the footage, the receipts, and the tech. Karen had only her delusion, and a bruised ego. By the time the officers wrapped up their initial investigation and Karen was finally released from the garage, the sun had started to rise and half the neighborhood had taken notice. She stomped down my driveway in a flurry of indignation and muttered legal threats under her breath, trying to preserve the last shreds of her dignity. Her hair was a frizzled mess, her hoodie was stained with oil, and her face was still blotchy from the sobbing fit she threw when the cops didn't arrest me on the spot. I watched her storm off, sipping my coffee while leaning casually against the ATV she had tried so hard to steal, knowing full well this wasn't over. And I was right, because Karen didn't just lick her wounds and move on. She escalated. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA titled "Violation Notice. Improper use of private garage." Attached was a blurry, zoomed-in screenshot of my ATV and a paragraph accusing me of violating community guidelines by using my garage for mechanical storage of unauthorized motor vehicles. The ridiculous part? My ATV was parked exactly how any normal person would store a vehicle, in a locked, secure garage on my own private property. But somehow, according to Karen and the 3 friends she had on the HOA board, it was now grounds for disciplinary action. At first, I laughed it off. I figured the board would quickly realize how absurd the complaint was and toss it in the trash. But by the next morning, another notice arrived. This time physically posted on my front door with red tape. It included a fine of $200 and a mandatory meeting request. Apparently, they were treating this seriously. I called the HOA office, only to be put on hold for 20 minutes and then told by a receptionist named Carol that all violations are reviewed by the board president. I asked who the president was. She said, "Currently, that would be Karen." My jaw actually dropped. I had no idea she held the top position. No wonder she was acting like a tyrant. What made things worse was how quickly the gossip spread. Some neighbors began acting strangely around me. People who normally waved suddenly avoided eye contact. A few started whispering when I passed by. It didn't take long before I learned that Karen had been telling people I was a thief, a scammer who tricked a dying man out of his ATV and then booby-trapped my garage to trap her like a criminal. Her version of the story made her sound like a grieving niece trying to reclaim a family heirloom, not a woman who literally broke in using bolt cutters and triggered a biometric security system. I thought about posting the video footage online but hesitated. Something told me to wait. If she was going to play the HOA card, I needed to be patient and smart. So instead, I contacted my old friend Marcus, a lawyer and former tech startup partner, who now specialized in property disputes and defamation cases. I sent him all the video footage, the HOA notices, and the copies of the purchase agreement from the original ATV seller. After reviewing everything, Marcus called me back with a half-laugh, half-growl in his voice. He said this was one of the most bizarre cases he'd ever seen, but it was also open and shut. He recommended filing a formal complaint to the HOA's Oversight Committee, which apparently existed but had been inactive for years thanks to Karen's influence. He also suggested I begin documenting everything and prepare for the possibility of legal action, not just for the break-in, but for defamation and abuse of authority. Marcus even drafted a letter to the HOA warning them that continuing to pursue false claims could result in a lawsuit. I mailed the letter, certified, but Karen wasn't fazed. Instead of backing down, she doubled the fine, citing a previously unenforced subsection in the HOA bylaws about visual conformity. She claimed my ATV, being black with red decals, violated the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. I nearly choked on my cereal reading that. Apparently, she believed it clashed with the natural color palette of the community, whatever that meant. She also claimed it was aggressive in appearance and provoked anxiety in neighboring residents. That same week, I noticed a group of Karen's loyalists from the neighborhood hosting what looked like an emergency HOA meeting in her front yard. Foldable chairs were set up, and about a dozen people, mostly older residents who rarely left their homes, sat there sipping lemonade while Karen waved printed screenshots of my garage footage and barked about community safety. She even printed the ATV listing from Facebook, claiming it was fraudulent and had the nerve to call it stolen valor in vehicle form. I could only imagine how she explained her 2 a.m. garage crawl. But not everyone bought her version of the story. I started receiving anonymous messages from other residents. One neighbor left a note under my doormat saying, "We saw the footage. She's crazy. Let us know if you need support." Another sent a text from an unknown number simply saying, "Karen's lying. I have receipts if needed." I wasn't sure who they were, but I knew the tide was beginning to shift. Her grip on the narrative was slipping, even if she didn't realize it yet. Then, something unexpected happened. I received a message request on social media from a guy named Tyler. I didn't recognize the name until I opened the message. He introduced himself as Karen's estranged nephew, the son of the cousin she claimed had promised her the ATV. Tyler wrote, "Hey man, I saw a clip of your security footage. That ATV used to be my dad's. Karen's full of it. He couldn't stand her and sold that thing himself because he didn't want her getting her hands on it. I helped him list it. That's your ride fair and square." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Not only was this guy real, but he had the receipts to prove everything. He attached screenshots of the listing process, including messages between him and his dad about selling it. He even had a notarized document from the estate showing the sale was approved and clean. I nearly dropped my phone out of excitement. This wasn't just a defense anymore, it was a full-on takedown. With Tyler's permission, I forwarded the documents to Marcus. He grinned over the phone and said, "We just hit the jackpot." Karen's web of lies was finally beginning to unravel, and now we had a direct witness from the family confirming she had no legal or moral claim to the vehicle. What she'd done wasn't just neighborhood drama. It was attempted theft, harassment, and now, possibly, fraud against the HOA itself for misusing her power to launch personal vendettas. I spent the next few hours organizing everything, photos, messages, documents, into a clean digital file. I named it Karen Files, Truth Edition. I knew the endgame was approaching, and if Karen wanted a war, I was ready to fight it with facts, footage, and every ounce of patience I had left. And just as I was wrapping up my documentation, another HOA notice arrived. But this one was different. It wasn't signed by Karen. It came from the HOA's Oversight Committee, newly reactivated, requesting a meeting to review the actions of the board president following multiple complaints from community members. It was happening. The fortress was cracking. And Karen had no idea the collapse had already begun. When I received the official letter from the HOA Oversight Committee, I didn't smile immediately. I stared at it for a full minute, rereading the details again and again, letting it settle in that the machine Karen had built around herself was starting to malfunction. The notice was brief but clear. It invited both the HOA board and myself to attend an independent review session to assess the validity of the recent violations and determine whether the board president, meaning Karen, had acted outside her authority. It wasn't just a warning, it was the start of something real. I forwarded the letter to Marcus, who replied in all caps, telling me not to say a word without him present and to prepare for the opportunity we'd been waiting for. Karen, on the other hand, was not taking things quietly. The day after the letters went out, she was seen patrolling the neighborhood in what she called her HOA mobile, basically her golf cart draped in laminated signs that said things like "Protect Community Integrity" and "Say No to Outlaws." She drove in slow circles, stopping to hand out flyers to confused neighbors who mostly took them just to make her go away. I got a hold of one, and it was pure lunacy. There were doctored photos of my ATV next to images of street gang vehicles, claims that my garage was being used to stockpile surveillance equipment, and even an accusation that I had connections to foreign tech espionage. The whole thing was so outrageous that Marcus laughed for 5 minutes straight when I showed him. But I wasn't laughing when the situation escalated again. This time, Karen filed a formal countersuit through a shady online legal service, accusing me of emotional trauma, intentional sabotage, and something called electronic entrapment, which wasn't even a real legal term. She claimed that by programming the facial ID system to recognize her and lock the garage, I had personally targeted her with malicious tech. Marcus filed an immediate motion to dismiss, attaching video footage and documentation that showed the system was entirely automated and had denied her entry as it would for anyone without registered access. Still, Karen's goal wasn't to win. It was to keep harassing. What she didn't know was that Marcus had already been preparing something far more powerful in the background. With Tyler's consent, he filed an official cease and desist request, citing defamation, attempted theft, and community harassment. He included signed statements from Tyler, messages proving the ATV was sold through legal means, and even text conversations showing the cousin specifically wanted to keep Karen far away from his belongings. The document package was over 80 pages long and delivered both digitally and in person to Karen's residence. She was served while setting up lawn chairs for yet another HOA rally. One of the neighbors filmed her reaction, her face flipping from smug confidence to wide-eyed panic in 2 seconds. She screamed that it was a forgery, claimed Marcus was a hired hacker, and then shouted something about filing a countersuit against Tyler, even though he lived 3 states away. I tried to avoid watching it more than once, but I'll admit, I replayed it a few times just to savor the sound of the papers being dropped into her trembling hands. Then came the review hearing. I arrived with Marcus, wearing a pressed shirt and carrying a digital tablet with all our evidence neatly organized. Karen arrived with a rolling cart of binders and a neck brace she clearly didn't need. She had gone full drama mode. The hearing was held at the HOA Community Center, with 5 neutral oversight members seated like a makeshift jury. One of them, a retired judge named Hal, looked like he had seen enough of this kind of nonsense in his lifetime and was already done before we started. Karen launched into a monologue that made everyone in the room blink in disbelief. She claimed I had been harboring military-grade surveillance gear, said my garage was a black site, and even suggested that I was recruiting children through ATV rides. Marcus raised a single eyebrow and then calmly played the footage of her breaking into the garage, followed by the facial ID denial and the automated security response. We showed timestamps, system logs, and even an engineering breakdown of how the system worked without manual control. Karen tried to object, but Hal cut her off. "You do realize this is a private property matter and not a spy thriller," he said. The room went quiet. Karen began fidgeting in her chair and turned her attacks toward the oversight board, accusing them of bias and saying the whole thing was a witch hunt. That didn't help her case. When it came time to rule, the board unanimously dismissed all violations against me and ordered the HOA to revoke Karen's fines and issue a written apology. They also suspended Karen from making unilateral decisions as board president until further notice. The silence outside the community center when we exited was oddly satisfying. Karen stood on the steps, frozen like a statue, clutching her fake neck brace while neighbors whispered and glanced away. Some avoided her entirely. A few came up to me and apologized for believing her stories. One elderly woman said, "We just thought she was trying to keep the neighborhood safe. We didn't realize she was completely unhinged." I told her it was all right. It wasn't the first time someone underestimated how far Karen would go. But that wasn't the end. Karen never simply retreats. She rebrands. A week after the hearing, she returned with a new cause. She declared herself the founder of a self-proclaimed neighborhood watch group called CTCH, Citizens Against Technological Criminal Havens. She printed cheap yellow vests for her and 2 other loyalists and began pacing the sidewalks with walkie-talkies, occasionally pointing at houses and scribbling on a notepad like she was building a case. Her nonsense would have been funny if she weren't still trying to stir up more trouble. I kept things calm. Marcus encouraged me not to engage and instead stay focused on finishing the final move we had planned. Tyler had offered one more bombshell. Among his father's documents was a notarized memo stating the ATV was gifted as part of a broader estate liquidation. Karen had never been listed as a beneficiary. With that, Marcus filed an official complaint against Karen for HOA abuse, citing her misuse of authority and personal vendettas, and included the new documentation. He also looped in a local real estate attorney who had been quietly building a case for a group of homeowners also tired of Karen's reign. Then came the best part. The HOA president resigned. Not Karen, she refused, but the actual elected president, who had only held the title on paper while Karen manipulated everything from behind the scenes. He stepped down in a formal letter stating he could no longer ethically support the board's actions. That left a power vacuum, and within days, an emergency election was announced. Karen submitted her name for consideration again, but this time she wasn't the only name on the ballot. A quiet but well-respected neighbor named Dana threw her name in too, backed by almost everyone Karen had ever harassed. Flyers started appearing that said, "Vote Dana, let's end the drama." I couldn't have written it better if I tried. The morning of the HOA election was unseasonably bright, the kind of day that almost dared something dramatic to happen. And right on cue, Karen appeared in full pageantry. She had a custom sash that read, HOA President, reinstated soon, and wore a blazer over a campaign shirt with her own face on it. She passed out cookies with stickers saying "Vote Smart, Vote Karen," though most neighbors just politely declined and stepped aside. Dana, on the other hand, simply walked house to house with a calm smile and a small stack of brochures that said, "Let's return to peace." No slogans, no drama, just quiet confidence and a promise to rebuild trust. The difference in their approaches couldn't have been clearer, and as I watched from my porch with a coffee in hand, I had a feeling this day would mark the end of something Karen wouldn't see coming. By noon, the community center parking lot was full. People who hadn't attended a single meeting in years came out for this vote. Some arrived with folded chairs. A few wore Team Dana pins. The energy was tense but polite, like everyone silently agreed they were witnessing the climax of a long, exhausting saga. Karen gave a speech that lasted 20 rambling minutes. She went off-script half a dozen times, bringing up things like moral decay, technological overreach, and vehicular intimidation. She even accused me, without naming me, of building a surveillance state inside our community. She ended by dramatically holding up the infamous obituary again, claiming she was still grieving the theft of her birthright. Dana kept her speech short. She simply thanked everyone for their patience, apologized for the dysfunction of the past year, and promised transparency and fairness moving forward. She didn't mention Karen at all. And somehow, that silence said more than anything Karen had shouted in her theatric. Voting opened immediately after. Paper ballots were handed out and dropped into a secure box under the supervision of 3 neutral volunteers. Within an hour, the results were counted, verified, and announced to the crowd. Dana won by a landslide. The crowd actually applauded. Neighbors who had never spoken before smiled and exchanged quiet cheers. It felt like the entire community exhaled at once. Karen stood stiffly at the side of the stage, blinking rapidly, as if the reality hadn't settled in. For once, she was speechless. But only for a moment. Then she stormed to the microphone and shouted that the vote was rigged. She accused the ballot counters of collusion and claimed Dana had weaponized peace. Her microphone was cut off mid-rant. Someone near the front coughed to hide a laugh. Another person said loud enough for everyone to hear, "She really thought this was her kingdom." By the next morning, Karen's signs had been removed. Her CTCH patrol vests were no longer in circulation. Dana sent out her first email as president, outlining new procedures and announcing a formal audit of the HOA's actions over the past 12 months. That audit was what really triggered Karen's downfall. She had done more than just meddle with my life. She had left a trail of questionable fines, suspicious invoices, and inconsistent record-keeping. It didn't take long before discrepancies popped up. Services paid for but never rendered. Duplicate charges to specific households, mostly ones she didn't like. Personal expenses buried in the budget under vague labels like community enrichment. Dana hired a third-party accounting firm to do a full review. Karen tried to block it with legal threats, but they were empty. She no longer had the power. The auditors uncovered nearly $8,000 in misappropriated funds. One of the most telling entries was a series of recurring charges listed as HOA advisory services, which turned out to be payments to her cousin's teenager for cutting her lawn and walking her dog. When this was presented in a community meeting, Karen wasn't even present. She had stopped attending altogether, choosing instead to post vague updates on a Facebook group she created called The Real HOA Voice. Only 5 people joined, and 2 of them were clearly fake accounts she made herself. Meanwhile, I was finally able to relax. The ATV sat in my garage, untouched and peacefully charged. I gave it a new name, Justice Machine, and added a small decal that made some neighbors chuckle every time they passed by. Word of the break-in and the facial ID system had spread so widely that I began getting requests from local news channels to do interviews. I declined most of them, but I did say yes to one podcast hosted by a group of engineers and digital rights advocates. The episode was titled, "The Day a Karen Met the Future," and it quickly gained traction. I didn't trash her name, but I didn't have to. The facts alone were enough. They played audio clips of her getting denied by the ATV's security and laughed so hard they had to pause recording. But the final cherry on top came when the auditors submitted their findings to the County Compliance Board. See, some of the HOA's financial reports had to be filed with the county due to neighborhood zoning laws and tax code. Karen had signed every single one of those reports, including the ones with the false numbers, which meant the lies weren't just internal, they were now on record. Official record. That's when things became serious. The county launched an inquiry. Karen was sent a notice for an interview and warned that failure to comply could lead to formal charges. She tried to run damage control by sending out emails blaming the previous treasurer. But he had long since moved and submitted a statement saying Karen took full control over expenditures without board approval. She had made herself queen of a kingdom that didn't legally exist. Her reign had crumbled into dust. And the fallout wasn't limited to her. The few allies she had left on the board resigned before they could be scrutinized. One of them even sent a quiet apology to me, admitting that they knew what she was doing but were afraid to speak out. It would have been satisfying enough to leave it there. But I had one more surprise. I organized a small neighborhood gathering and invited everyone except Karen. It was an open garage party, snacks, cold drinks, some light music, and I gave informal demos of the security system that had stopped her in her tracks. People laughed as I showed the unauthorized face detected alert, and one neighbor joked about installing it at the community pool entrance. Even Tyler, her nephew, drove down for the weekend and brought a framed photo of his dad, which he placed next to the justice machine. He gave a short toast, thanking everyone for standing up to nonsense and saying his father would have laughed seeing Karen locked in that garage. Karen didn't show her face again for a while. Word had it she was staying with a relative out of town. Her house sat quiet, the porch light off, the once frequent HOA banners removed. A for sale sign appeared 3 weeks later. She left quietly without a goodbye. Some said she moved in with a cousin. Others heard she relocated to a different HOA community. I couldn't help but think, wherever she landed, someone was probably already dealing with her antics. Hopefully they had better security. By the time summer rolled around, the neighborhood felt normal again. Kids rode their bikes without being yelled at. People waved more. Dana kept her promises. She held regular meetings, opened financial records to anyone who asked, and even created a small garden fund for communal beautification projects. Peace had returned, and so had common sense. But every now and then, I'd catch someone glancing at the garage and smirking. They knew the story. They remembered the night Karen tried to reclaim an ATV that was never hers and ended up triggering a fortress built with sensors, logic, and quiet revenge. And sometimes, when the garage door opened with a gentle mechanical hum and the red lights flickered to life for just a second, I'd think about her crouched under the workbench, whispering conspiracies to herself, and wonder if she ever realized that the garage hadn't just denied her entry. It had closed the door on her entire empire. It had been nearly 2 months since Karen vanished from the neighborhood, and her house had just gone under contract. The for sale sign had a red stripe across it that said, pending, and judging by the moving truck parked out front, she was making her departure official. No one went over to say goodbye. A few residents glanced out their windows, some with relief, others with curiosity, as Karen barked orders at the movers with the same aggression she once used to cite people for leaving recycling bins out too long. Her voice still carried across the cul-de-sac, shrill and bitter, as if she had unfinished business with the asphalt itself. I stood in my driveway, leaning against the ATV with my arms crossed, quietly observing. She avoided making eye contact. Her reign had ended not with a bang, but with one last tantrum, thrown into a box and taped shut. I could have left it there. Let her ride off into obscurity, buried under her own failed empire. But as fate would have it, Karen had one final surprise for me before she left. 2 days after the moving truck disappeared, I received a certified envelope marked with an out-of-state return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on floral stationery. It was from Karen. The opening line made me laugh out loud. Despite everything, I still believe I was right. She went on to claim that she had only been trying to uphold moral values and community standards, and accused me of humiliating her intentionally. She called the garage security system excessive, the livestream a form of psychological warfare, and the ATV a weapon of division. But then the letter took an unexpected turn. Karen wrote that she had hired an attorney to help her investigate digital defamation and cyberbullying, and that she had plans to pursue action against the HOA for allowing what she called an orchestrated coup. It was delusional, desperate, but it reminded me why I'd spent months ensuring the truth was recorded in full. I sent the letter to Marcus, who advised me not to respond. He reminded me that any communication from her going forward could be part of a legal strategy. So instead of replying, I archived it and went about my life. But that letter wasn't the end of Karen's attempt at a comeback. A week later, a strange post appeared on a small legal blog in a neighboring state. It was an anonymous opinion piece titled, "When HOAs Betray Their Heroes." The writing was unmistakable, filled with phrases like community martyr and justice through policy. The article painted a vague story of a woman wronged by an ungrateful neighborhood and a man who used technological trickery to turn neighbors against her. It even described a suspicious vehicle that glowed red like a devil's machine. It was so on the nose I nearly spit out my drink reading it. Karen was trying to rewrite history, but history wasn't on her side. Because around that same time, the county office completed its investigation into the HOA finances, and their report made it clear that Karen hadn't just been dramatic, she had been dangerously negligent. Thousands in unaccounted spending, unapproved contracts, false citations that generated funds for petty projects. Dana made the report public, sending it out to every resident with a brief note assuring them that reforms were already underway. The community read every line. Some people were shocked. Others simply nodded. But one thing was clear. No one wanted her back. I decided it was time to put a final stamp on the whole ordeal. Inspired by all the attention the ATV had received, I reached out to a friend who worked at a local motorsports museum that also featured technology exhibit. After seeing the footage, the custom security design, and the community story, they asked if I'd consider lending the ATV and the story for a month-long special feature. They called it The Neighborhood That Fought Back. It wasn't just about one crazy incident, it was about a community rediscovering its voice, standing up against petty tyranny, and finding unity through absurdity. I agreed, and the ATV was transported with full care to a center display, complete with a motion sensor that played the unauthorized face-detected audio on loop. Visitors loved it. Kids laughed, adults shook their heads, and the museum asked if they could extend the exhibit for another month. I said yes. Back in the neighborhood, the air was different, quieter, happier. Without Karen's constant patrolling and passive-aggressive notes, people started spending more time outside. Lawn chairs appeared on porches again. Someone brought back the block party tradition that Karen had squashed years ago, claiming it created disruptive noise patterns. Now, music floated through the street again. Children drew chalk rainbows on the sidewalk without being scolded. It felt like our zip code had been cured of an infection, and in some poetic way, the garage, the place where this entire saga had reached its turning point, became a symbol. People began referring to it as the vault. Some even joked about nominating it for a neighborhood landmark. I embraced the joke. I added a small LED sign above the garage door that simply read, "Access denied," and let it glow every night. Then came a small, unexpected twist. One afternoon, Dana called and asked if I had a moment to meet at the community center. I arrived to find her standing with a man in a suit and a binder in his hand. He introduced himself as a representative from a regional homeowners association network. Apparently, our neighborhood had become something of a case study in HOA governance. They were creating a training module on ethical board practices, and our story, particularly the handling of Karen's misuse of power, was being considered as a key example. I was stunned. The man asked if I would be willing to speak at a panel in a few months to share the experience, and maybe, if comfortable, show parts of the footage to illustrate the importance of transparency and accountability. I agreed on the condition that no identifying footage of Karen's face would be shown. Not because she deserved protection, but because I had moved on. And that was the most surprising part of it all. After months of tension, confrontations, and legal twists, I didn't feel angry anymore. Just relieved. Karen had tried to storm my garage, steal my property, smear my name, and weaponize an entire HOA. But she'd failed. Not because I fought harder than her, but because I fought smarter, with evidence, patience, and a community that eventually opened its eyes. I didn't win by shouting louder. I won by letting the truth echo louder than her lies. Months passed. The exhibit wrapped up. The neighborhood remained calm. Karen never returned. I occasionally got messages from former HOA presidents in other cities asking questions about my setup. I'd answer when I could, offer advice, or just share a laugh. My story had gone farther than I ever imagined, but in the end it always came back to the same core lesson. It wasn't about the ATV. It wasn't even about the garage. It was about boundaries, literal and figurative, and what happens when someone thinks they can bulldoze through them just because they feel entitled to do so. One evening, as I locked up for the night, I stood in the middle of my garage and looked at the now empty space where the ATV used to rest. I didn't feel loss. I felt closure. The walls around me weren't just built with concrete and code, they were built with lessons, laughter, and a memory that would stay with me longer than any machine. I reached out, tapped the lock button, and the security system responded with its familiar hum. The lights dimmed. The sensors blinked. The system whispered its last phrase before shutting down for the night.